This week we'll talk to the founder of South Africa's first mobile phone film-making competition and also the extraordinary real-life story of a man inspired by a popular beer commercial. A warm welcome to Mags on Media. Now, just one story dominating South African media right now, the Oscar Pistorius-Reeva Steenkamp tragedy. As well as his fall from grace, killer athlete Pistorius stands to lose millions in sponsorship. We were joined a little earlier in the week by two experts in the field, Clive Grinnicker from Grinsport, along with Michael Goldman from the Gordon Institute of Business Science. Michael Goldman, let me start with you first of all. It seems these days there is more risk in sponsoring sports stars. You think of Lance Armstrong, Tiger Woods, and this terrible tragedy around Oscar Pistorius. What's happened?
Well, certainly I think the media storm around these kind of incidents has been amplified given the globalization we have and the fact that news now reaches all the four corners of the planet so quickly. And so I think that continues to change, and globalization is happening around us so quickly that I think we don't really realize the implications of that into the far-flung parts of the world. And so, I was in Kenya last week, and as the Oscar story broke, it was the #1 story, and they're going through presidential elections. But Oscar's story was the #1 story across local channels in Kenya. So, I think what we're seeing is with media and with social media, you really are able to, the stories are getting out there much, much quicker. Whether the athletes now are riskier than athletes were before, I'm not so sure. Perhaps the stories now are coming out more quickly and more clearly than they were before, although the story perhaps would have come out anyway.
Clive Grinnicker, having said that though, there is still huge value in brand association with sports stars. Doesn't matter what happens, this is never going to stop, is it?
No, in fact it's just getting bigger and better because sport is getting bigger and better. You just have to look at they become the face of the product, and because they're using the product, they have huge fans, so the fans want to use those products. And really it's a great advertising method for companies that believe in those athletes.
But Michael Goldman, more risky these days though, which also means that you need a risk mitigation or a fallout strategy. What would that entail?
Absolutely. Since the Tiger incidents, we've seen a dramatic change in the kind of contracts that are being signed with athletes. Much shorter contracts, more campaign-driven. So what we saw with Mnet, for example, around Oscar Pistorius was more campaign contract as opposed to an ongoing multi-year contract. Secondly, the whole issue of moral clauses and the opportunity for sponsors to write that in very clearly so they have an easy opt-out from a legal point of view in the relationship with the athlete. And then secondly, thirdly, the whole issue of providing additional support to the athlete, that it's not just sign a check, cheers, I'll see you for a few ad campaigns, but now playing a more active role in supporting that athlete. Athletes in their 20s that are getting such significant investments into their lives, that are now living in luxury and having fabulous cars, etc. How do sponsors help those athletes really deal with that? Because if they're not doing it, who's doing it for the athletes?
What's your view on that, Clive? This risk mitigation strategy, and I presume that these contracts are supported by a bastion of lawyers.
Now, the first big example of this was when Louis Late sued Nelson Mandela, you remember, because of the Commission of Inquiry and who had the authority. Nike sponsored SA Rugby. They didn't have an out clause, and they were very embarrassed because Mandela was, and still is, the icon of the world. So contracts have been tightened up, and you only ever use a contract when something goes wrong. If everything's going fine, I bet you that all the sponsors of Gary Player, Jack Nicklaus, Arnold Palmer, who've had fantastic careers, they've never looked at those contracts because they've never had to. So quite rightly now, sponsors entering into endorsement deals with athletes have to make sure that they are tightly protected, that they have an out clause the minute there's any reputational damage to the relationship.
Michael, what about sort of a pre-check when it comes to these things? You've got to look at the athlete and, are they predisposed to any sort of bad behavior? Have they done bad things in the past? I presume this kind of pre-audit happens all the time, doesn't it?
Well, one would think that it would happen all the time. And I think due diligence, it's kind of like a merger and acquisition.
That's the word I was looking for.
Exactly,
yeah.
Because what you're having is two brands coming together. It's a co-branding relationship. And so when you're associating your very powerful multi-billion-dollar brand like a Nike or a Terry Mugler, and you're associating it with another brand, well, you know, whoever's brand that is, the athlete's brand, you better know and understand exactly what's standing behind that brand. What does that brand stand for? What are the brand values? What's the brand behavior going back? Because you're really associating, and going forward, those brands are going to be seen together. So the due diligence, I think, is really, really important. And then on an ongoing basis, what are the early warning signs? And so, you know, there have been many reports in the last few days, people looking back and saying with hindsight, we could have seen perhaps that some of these things may have been coming with this incident. And so for those brands that were involved, what kind of early warning systems do they have in place? Where they're sitting down once a month, once a quarter, and saying, let's look at the properties that we're invested in. Let's look at those that are endorsing us. And what are the opportunities there that this could be going sideways?
All well and good to look at the hindsight thing, Clive Griniker, but I'd also suggest to you that brands are often seduced by the power of the brand that they're going to sponsor.
That's exactly it. That's why they enter into it. It's a great form of advertising and promoting the product. But at the end of the day, you've got to look at someone like Tiger Woods, who was embroiled in a massive scandal, but he is still sponsored by Nike. He's just no longer the top Nike golfer. Rory McIlroy is now got a $250 million deal. Tiger's down to $105 million from Nike. So he is still endorsed. So he never killed anyone. He never cheated the sport itself. He never affected a result in a golf game. So what he did was completely off the golf course, which is where he's actually sponsored for his excellence as a golfer.
You've halfway answered the next question, but do brands in the long term really feel the fallout?
No, they don't, because they have to, the minute a scandal erupts, like this Oscar Pistorius. Now, if you read the media, none of them have pulled out immediately because they wanted to see and wait for the process of the law to take its place. But as the evidence comes out that suggests that there's probably going to be trouble brewing, so they have sort of suspended their sponsorships, etc.
I think Oakley is a case in point that's now distanced itself from Oscar Pistorius.
In the last few hours, we saw Oakley and Nike both distance themselves and suggest that they're either severing the relationship or not using the commercials that were already planned. I think Mnet was the one that acted very, very quickly, given their campaign that was about to hit the streets. And really what you want to look is in those first 5-6 days. Research suggests that if you're not acting within 10 days, you're losing share value. If you look at the Tiger Woods scandal, an analysis of all the brands that were associated with Tiger Woods suggested that altogether they lost $12 billion worth of value within the first 10 days for those brands that did not disassociate themselves immediately. And so you really have got a window of opportunity there of probably, you know, day 6, 7, and 8. And if you haven't pulled out by that time, you're saying to your consumers, you're saying to your shareholders, you're saying to your investors, I'm going for the long term, I'm supporting this athlete. And then if that goes badly, that really does go badly for you.
Clive Griniker, this is a multiple zero game. You mentioned these huge figures regarding Tiger Woods and Rory McIlroy, for instance. As far as Oscar Pistorius is concerned, what does he stand to lose?
You know, before the Olympics, he had some fantastic deals, but things doubled after the Olympics. I mean, when Valentine's Day, he was at the peak of his fame. And the media reports, depending what Pete van Zyl, his agent, would really allude to, it's anywhere between 17 and 40 million. I believe it's close to 40 million rand that he stands to lose. And that's because these are US dollar-based endorsement deals, not rand. So when you get the exchange rate, it's about a 40 million rand loss to his income.
Can he ever recover from this?
Highly unlikely. I think there is no other example. I mean, if you think back to O.J. Simpson, he was acquitted in the criminal case. In later cases, he was then found guilty, and he's currently in jail. So, you know, that's probably the closest we have to the storm that's erupted around this. And O.J. Simpson really never recovered, and I don't think that there's a chance of Oscar Pistorius recovering.
Clive Griniker, is this scandal bigger than O.J., Tiger, and Lance?
I think Lance is probably bigger right now because it's happened for so long. Yeah. I think that depending on how the court case goes for Oscar, because it could be a blatant murder. I mean, and he's more famous outside of South Africa than he is here. I mean, his demise will have as great an impact as Lance.
The views there of Clive Griniger from Grinsport and Michael Goldman from the Gordon Institute of Business Science talking to us earlier. Let's stay with the story, and we read this week that another sports brand is now distancing itself from celebrity endorsement. Reebok's latest global marketing campaign, Live with Fire, focuses on how customers are transforming their lives through fitness and interestingly leaves out brand ambassadors such as Lewis Hamilton and MS Dhoni, a sign of things to come, we think. Also, a little sympathy this week to independent newspapers for its inopportune placement of this ad for Outsurance during the Pistorius drama. Red faces all around, we think. We think the ad, though, was in appalling bad taste nonetheless and should have been pulled the moment the story broke. The company was right to apologise, but the damage has been done. And here's a quick view on how the international media has been viewing the story. David Smith, he's the South African correspondent for The Guardian newspaper, spoke to my colleague Joanne Joseph a little earlier in the week.
It's an absolutely massive story, certainly in Britain and in America, where it's made many front pages. I was talking to someone earlier today who said, frankly, it's got more coverage in Britain than it has in South Africa. Partly because we had the London Olympics only about 6 months ago. Oscar Pistorius was one of the big names, one of the big personalities, along with Usain Bolt in both the Paralympics and Olympics. So there's been immense interest and huge coverage, and within hours, newspapers like The Sun and The Mirror and the Daily Mail in Britain dispatched reporters to South Africa. They flew overnight. They were in court by Friday morning. And I think they'll be here for a long time. It's very, very big.
Depending on how the argument develops in court, either Pistorius will be portrayed as the paranoid victim of a violent society or a perpetrator of domestic violence. Well, would you say this case is being covered on the same scale in your country, particularly as perhaps the O.J. Simpson trial or the Conrad Murray trial?
Bigger than Conrad Murray, I would say. Hard to compete with O.J. Simpson. That was pretty colossal. But then again, times have changed. We now live in an internet age, so the news comes at you thick and fast, maybe even more than it did at the time of O.J. Simpson. And yes, even newspapers like the Financial Times that who wouldn't necessarily think this is their big story, they've been covering it, and it's just a really big talking point. Obviously, what actually happened in that room? Were shots fired? Who fired them? Could he have thought it was an intruder, and so on? This is a big discussion. It sort of fires up people's imagination, and it's a big human story that cuts across nations and continents and other barriers that everyone seems to have an interest in.
Let's talk a little bit about the arrival of Stuart Higgins. I mean, many people say the arrival of a publicist so soon after this news broke smacks a little bit of what happened in the Dhwani case, with Max Clifford flying in to manage the public perception of it. Would you say that that's not going to sit well with many members of the public?
Indeed, I think there's already been criticism of it, and I was actually delayed at court on Friday, sort of filing for my paper, and as I went downstairs in a little cafe, I spotted someone. I thought, he's familiar, and I went up to him, and it was Stuart Higgins, and he gave me his card. So I immediately put that onto Twitter, and immediately I was getting responses on Twitter, lots of cynicism, lots of, we've lost sympathy for Oscar Pistorius, hiring a PR man like this to sort of spin his way out of trouble. I think it's somewhat inevitable in the modern age that someone like the Pistorius family wants somebody with a lot of international experience and savvy on how to deal with the bombardment of media requests. And I think Stuart Higgins' company was involved, for example, in organising that statement read by the uncle on Saturday and getting that disseminated to agencies who they can then send it out elsewhere. So again, I'm not surprised, but yes, I certainly think the fact that he's a former British tabloid editor, and it's The Sun, and we've just been talking about the way The Sun does its front pages is not a very helpful mix.
Well, we'd like your views on the brand fallout from the Pistorius drama on our Facebook page on this address. Remember, we're also on Twitter 24/7. Here's the handle. Coming up, we'll be in conversation with the founder of the Josie Film Fest, but it's one with a difference. The movies are all on your phone.